This story is called One Foot in the Grave. Willie Mortis started out the window of his third-floor room at Floral Nursing and Rehabilitation Center and let out a deep, defeated sigh. His good friend Leonard McDaniel, who lived down the hallway in room 304, had passed from a heart attack the week prior and now taking up space, as they called it, across the street at Valleyview Cemetery. Leonard was a fellow New York Yankees fan, and he and Willie had bonded over their lifelong love for the Bronx Bombers. In fact, upon his death, Leonard left Willie his favorite Yankees cap. Willie kept it in a box for his closet for safekeeping, choosing to continue to wear his own decades-worn ball cap. Willie's nurse, a 20-something named Nicole, came into his room with a cart of food and set his lunch down next to his bed. She was dressed in mint green scrubs and had curly blonde hair that made Willie wish he had been born 50 years later. "Good afternoon, Willie," said Nicole, as she lifted off the plastic container covering his plate. It was Thursday, and that meant a piece of rubbery chicken, powdered mashed potatoes, a pear, and green jello. "Good afternoon," mumbled Willie as he maintained his gaze on the cemetery. He would normally greet Nicole with a smile and ask how her day was. Nicole sensed something was wrong. "I'm sorry about Leonard. I know you guys were close." Willie replied without turning away from the window. "Yeah." Nicole picked up his breakfast tray and placed it on the cart. "Well, I hope you enjoy your lunch." She was about to walk out of the room when Willie under his breath said, "It's almost like it's taunting us." Nicole stopped and turned back to him. "What's that, Willie?" Willie's eyes were transfixed on the swath of headstones and monuments poking out of the ground across the street. The area around Valleyview was relatively nice. There was a lush park on one side and a row of quaint little shops on the other. But that square of granite and marble directly across the street was an ever-present reminder that his days were numbered. He had lost 7 friends to Valleyview in the past 2 years, and they seemed to be dying off more frequently as of late. These weren't sickly, on their deathbed types either. These were active seniors, bingo fanatics, swim class regulars, bridge pros. He hadn't seen so many bite the big one in such a short span of time since his days in World War II. He knew what killed them back then. Artillery, explosions, Japs. What killed these folks was a mystery. That damn cemetery. It sits there across the street just waiting for us to croak. It's like some morbid assembly line, from here to there, with a funeral home somewhere in the middle. I might as well just walk on over and pour some dirt over my head, save someone the trouble. "Don't say that, Willie," said Nicole. She came over and rested her hand on his shoulder. "You've got a lot of life in you." "That's what I thought about Leonard, but look what happened to him. He was taking us to the cleaners and backgammon 1 minute, and then bam, dead as a duck. It just happens, Willie. There's no rhyme or reason to it. The best you can do is just keep on keeping on." Right, said Willie. "I'll try, but don't be surprised if you find me stiff as a board tomorrow morning." Nicole gave Willie a sympathetic smile and left the room. Willie spent the rest of the day staring out the window, watching people come in and out of the cemetery. A fat man carrying his lunch, a couple of joggers, a rich-looking couple walking their dog. The scene outside Willie's window eventually transitioned from pleasantly sunny to stiffingly dark. He was about to lie down for the night when he saw a flash of green from across the street. He focused his eyes on it, unsure of what would be coming out of the cemetery at such an hour. His eyesight had diminished severely over the years, so making out whatever it was, especially at night, was a tall order. It was a figure, that he knew for sure, and it was heading toward the nursing home. As it neared the door, he could finally make out what it was. A man in a mint green outfit. Before he could get a good look at his face, however, the man walked in through the front door and out of sight. Willie got out of bed as fast as his old bones would let him, grabbed his walker and went out to the hallway and up to the nurse's station. "Nicole! Nicole! I need to talk to Nicole!" shouted Willie as he approached the tall African-American nurse behind the counter. Her name tag read Gladys. Nicole's shift ended at 5, Mr. Morris, said Gladys. How can I help you? I saw someone, a strange-looking person, walking out of the cemetery and into this building. My eyes ain't like they used to be. Walked straight out of there like some damned ghoul, I tell ya. Who knows what they're up to? Were they doing anything suspicious? Well, for starters, who walks through the cemetery at this time of night? I thought they were closed at dusk. I'm just worried it might be some kind of thug or Satanist or something. Gladys rolled her eyes. Mr. Morris, we have extra tight security here. If any strange person tried coming in, our guards would stop them. Listen, if I see anybody suspicious, I'll let you know. What did you say this person looked like? Well, he was dressed completely in green and he... Willie stopped when he saw a man walking down the hall. He was dressed in mint green scrubs and he was heading right toward them. This is Heath, Willie, said Gladys as the man neared the station. He worked at the center for a couple of years. They just moved him from the first floor. Hi, Gladys, said Heath, smiling. He was a healthy-looking brown-haired guy with a chiseled face and a smile that could blind a man. Heath, this is Willie, said Gladys. Why, hello, Willie, said Heath. Pleased to meet you. He struck out his hand. Willie reluctantly shook the man's hand. Well, I'll be going to bed now. He turned and walked away, a strange and unnerving feeling in his stomach. On his way back to his room, Willie passed Jimmy Aisel, who lived in room 344. Jimmy was sitting in his favorite vinyl chair reading The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. Hi, Willie, said Jimmy. Hey, Jim. Jimmy put his book down. Shame about Leonard, huh? It's a damn shame, but I can't say I'm surprised. First Dad, then Larry, now Leonard. It's like some phantom virus has hit this place, maybe the Grim Reaper. Jimmy puffed up his chest. I want to see that Reaper son of a bitch mess with old Jimmy Aisel. Jimmy was a crack pilot in World War II, said to have shot 4 German bombers in less than 10 minutes in the summer of '43. Willie cracked a smile. You better come packing, huh? You betcha. Willie said goodnight to Jimmy and returned to his bedroom. He thought briefly about the person in the cemetery again before drifting off to sleep. Was it that Heath fella? The Germans were no match for Jimmy Aisel back in World War II, but death finally caught up to the soldier. The following morning, Gladys found him lying in bed, cold and blue. Willie watched from his window as paramedics wheeled Jimmy's corpse into a Leicestershire General ambulance and drove off. Another one? He walked out of his room, down the hallway, and peeked into Jimmy's room. The covers on Jimmy's bed were disheveled, and one of his mystery novels was still cracked open on his dresser. He looked back in the hall to see if anyone was watching, then entered the room. He flipped through the book on the dresser and smirked at the title, Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. He had always laughed at Jimmy's pulp novels. The writing was terrible, and the plots were beyond hokey. He stopped smiling, however, when he noticed a strange symbol written in red ink on the title page. It was triangular with what looked like 3 eyes appearing at each corner. The thing was intensely weird and gave him the willies. He walked out of the room and down the hall, stopping by the nurse's station where Nicole was working. Nicole, can you tell me who was taking care of Jimmy last night? Nicole looked at him with sympathy. Willie, I'm so sorry about Jimmy. Thanks, but can you tell me who was assigned to him? Nicole gave him an odd look and flipped through the logbook. It was the new guy Heath. Why do you ask? Just curious. He's a strange guy, said Nicole. She leaned in closer and lowered her voice. He was always smiling, but in a weird way with this vacant look. Willie listened intently and nodded. Keep this between you and me, Willie, but he and Gladys seem a bit too close. Willie perked up. Is that right? What do you mean? I caught them talking in private. They always give me funny looks too, like they have it out for me. Creeps me out. Willie thought about Gladys. She had been working on the floor for only 6 months or so. She wasn't the warmest of nurses. She mostly kept to herself. Don't tell anybody what I said, Willie. This is between you and me, okay? Willie nodded and returned to his room, worried for Nicole and for the rest of the folks in the building. Later that night, Willie sat in his chair and looked out his window. The cemetery was pitch black, save for the glow of a streetlight shining down upon the front gate. As he watched, the same strange man from the previous night emerged from the dark interior. He sprung out of bed and went to his door. Cracking it open, he peered out into the hallway. Heath was talking to Gladys at the nurse's station in hushed tones. After a minute, he left and entered the room of Judy Kirkpatrick, the floor's resident bingo all-star. 5 minutes later, Heath came out of Judy's room with a content look on his face, as if he had just finished a long and fulfilling supper. Willie walked up to the front desk. Gladys rolled her eyes as he approached. "Gladys, that Heath guy, where did you say he's from?" "Why do you ask, Mr. Morris?" Willie glared at her. "As a paying member of this establishment, I think I deserve to know who's taking care of us." Gladys stood up and leaned toward him. "Heath is a licensed practical nurse. That's all you need to know. Now go back to your room and get some rest." As Willie had expected, Judy was found dead the next morning. They drove her across town to Rice Funeral Home, a brief layover before they would bring her back and stick her in the ground across the road at Valleyview. That afternoon, Willie snuck into Judy's room looking for clues. Pictures of grandkids and relatives hung on the walls. The room smelled like mothballs and puring meatloaf. He picked up Judy's bingo card and flipped it around. There it was, the same triangular shape with the wicked eyes that he found in Jimmy's book. Willie went back to his room, his 78-year-old heart pounding in his chest. Despite his weak knees and bad back, Willie walked out of the nursing home that night and paid a visit to the cemetery. The nurses checked in every hour, so he would have to hurry back before anyone noticed. The graveyard felt darker than it had appeared from across the street. Headstones were completely shrouded in shadow, the names impossible to decipher by the unaided eye in the gloom of a light ground fog. He clicked on his flashlight and shone it on individual headstones. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew some answer had to lie on this plot of land. So many of his friends were buried here, and he owed it to them to find out. Grady Wintermute, Tom and Mary Brill. Names appeared in the glow of the flashlight as Willie scanned the cemetery. 20 minutes passed. His old bones quickly tired from the strain of the nighttime search. He stopped and gasped. There, in the befogged light, was the symbol almost jutting out at him from the severely weathered rock. The same emblem from Jimmy's book and Judy's bingo card. He pointed the flashlight further up the headstone and read the inscription, Heath Farrell, 1804 to 1844. Willie waited in his bedroom and waited. When the clock struck 9, he got out of his chair and peeked out into the hallway. He watched as Heath approached the nurse's station and talked to Gladys. When they finished talking, Heath went into the kitchen and came out pushing a large food cart. He went down the hallway and Willie followed, tiptoeing behind. Heath pushed the cart into Agnes Hamilton's room and closed the door behind him. Willie put his head against the door and listened. He heard Heath greeting Agnes and talking to her about the plants sitting on her windowsill. The conversation ceased and Willie heard footsteps walking back toward the door. Quickly, he moved away from the door and pretended to walk down the hall. A second later, Heath came out pushing the cart. He looked at Willie, smiled, and turned the corner to the next corridor. Willie rushed into Agnes's room, hoping there was still time to save her. But when he got inside, Agnes was wide awake watching Wheel of Fortune, not a scratch on her. She actually looked quite content. "Willie Morris, what are you doing?" "I'm sorry, Agnes. I thought I heard you call for help." He didn't know if Heath would return, and he wanted to make sure he was there if he did. Willie woke up the next morning in the hallway, his neck aching from his awkward sleep position. He saw Agnes's room was empty, so he walked to the nurse's station and greeted Gladys. "Can you tell me how Agnes Hamilton is doing?" "Agnes? Why do you ask?" "Agnes is totally fine. She's down in 112 playing pinochle." Willie felt relieved, yet utterly confused. "Unfortunately, Violet Bradford passed away last night," continued Gladys. Willie looked at her dumbstruck. "Violet Bradford down on the first floor?" Gladys nodded. Who was working down there last night? Nicole and I. Why do you ask? No reason. He walked back to his room, unsure of what to make of the night's events. Maybe there was another Heath Farrell back in the 19th century. Maybe the name was just a coincidence and this nursing home wasn't haunted by a soul-sucking vampire. The day passed uneventfully. Willie didn't know what to make of the death on the first floor. He went to bed early that night and was awakened by the sound of someone entering his room. He lay in bed, his eyes barely cracked open. As they slowly adjusted to the light, he could see it was Nicole. She didn't have food or medication on her and his room didn't need to be clean, so he wondered what she was doing. He watched as she crept to his dresser and strangely picked up his Yankees cap. An intense light suddenly formed around the cap. Willie watched in shock as Nicole slowly sucked some sort of ephemeral substance into her mouth. He shivered as her tongue lapped up the energy, a demented look in her eyes. Willie suddenly felt a sharp pain in his chest as if someone had jabbed him with a kitchen knife and was turning it back and forth. He felt as if his lungs were being sucked out by an industrial-strength vacuum. The door swung open and in walked Gladys. Nicole quickly dropped the hat and all of Willie's pain began to subside. We've got a code 5 on the first floor. Let's go, said Gladys. Nicole and Gladys left the room and Willie got out of bed still shaking. Flipping it over, he saw the same strange triangular symbol burned into the brim. He didn't sleep that night. When Nicole walked into Willie's room the next morning to drop off his breakfast, she seemed startled to see him awake. What's wrong, Nicole? Didn't expect to find me in such good health? He said, smirking. Nicole's stupefied look transformed into one of intense annoyance. What do you mean, Willie? Nothing. Just an old man talking nonsense. Thanks for bringing me my breakfast. Ooh, bacon and eggs. Nicole left the room without saying another word. Later that day at Willie's request, Nicole accompanied him to the cemetery to visit Jimmy Asel's grave. As always, Willie wore his Yankees cap. It was evening and the sun was just beginning to approach the horizon. I know you weren't asleep last night, said Nicole as they walked the gravel path. I'm an old man. I don't sleep that well. I have crazy dreams with all this medication you guys make me take. I want to show you something before we stop at Jimmy's grave. Over this way. They turned into an older, more secluded corner of the cemetery. The headstones in the sections were crumbling. Some of them were barely holding together. They approached the grave. It almost felt inevitable. There, inscribed in granite, was the name Nicole Mayer. A small daguerreotype appeared underneath, and it looked as if Nicole had posed for it not a week prior. Willie looked at her aghast, and she smiled back as if she were waiting for his reaction. Why, Nicole? He said gently. Why? I can't die, Willie. She grabbed his arm and he winced at the inhuman strength of this petite woman. I had a feeling about you, Nicole, said Gladys, who appeared from behind a mausoleum with Heath. We had to be sure, said Heath. It's been so long since I felt your presence. I'd almost forgotten your true form. Without hesitation, Heath and Gladys rushed toward Nicole and tried to tackle her. Nicole easily dispatched Gladys, throwing her to the ground and knocking her out cold. Heath grabbed Nicole by the arms and the two tumbled on the grass. Heath managed to get on top of her, but Nicole pushed him up and tossed him aside with ease. She stood quickly and lunged toward Willie, tackling him to the sod, wrapping her arms around his feeble head. Don't worry, Jimmy, she said. You'll get to see Jimmy real soon. Her lips parted, she started her sucking routine, a fantastic glow appearing around his baseball cap. But something was wrong. She started choking, then convulsing like a cat heaving up a massive hairball. She arched her back and howled, dropping the cap and Willie to the ground. What? What did you do? She said, holding the cap in her trembling hand. The glow around the cap receded, and Nicole's body began to disintegrate. Her powers directed not toward Willie's energy, but toward the dead aura of Jimmy Asel. The skin on her face caved inward, revealing a rotting black skull. The rest of her body followed. her bones cracking and a vile oozing substance draining from her until she was reduced to a pile of putrid ash on the ground. The trio stood silently around the remnants of Nicole. A harsh wind blew, scattering whatever remained of her throughout the cemetery. Willie picked up the cap and looked at the brim. The name Jimmy Acel was written in black marker on the inside. No symbol, no curse. It had worked. "We didn't know it was her," said Gladys, walking up to Willie with a weary look on her face. Heath appeared behind her, and it was clear under the moonlight that he was not comprised of the same flesh and blood as Willie. He could see right through him and could make out Jimmy's grave through his shade. I was her first victim. Heath explained some of it to Willie. Some people have unfinished business and are left in between worlds with the option of improving their lot in the unliving. He had chosen to work toward a higher plane of existence. Nicole had taken the easy route, intending to occupy this world for as long as she could by draining the living of their life force. Heath thanked Willie and Gladys before fading away into an ethereal light. On his way home, Willie stopped by Jimmy's grave and dropped off his friend's baseball cap. He smiled as he returned to his window seat at Floral Nursing. The place across the road didn't seem quite so ominous anymore.